This week, we're putting the final nail in Scaretober's coffin, and we're going to see if any of the films we watch deserve to be impaled on our wall of fame.
Welcome back to How Did You Miss This? The show where we dance on the graves of our movie-watching history. I'm Evan Teller-Hickey, and with me as always, Michael Hansen and Krista Shane. And today, we are doing our final wrap-up of Scaretober. What a wild ride it's been, y'all. We've watched The Lost Boys. We've watched The Exorcist. We've watched Us. We've watched Halloween. We've watched Hereditary. All movies. And let's talk a little bit about horror and these films and if any of them deserve a place upon the coveted How Did You Miss This? Wall of Fame, or even if we'll make a whole new award to pin one of these up.
I am excited to see. We do want to see if any of these are worthy of a place. But I'm just curious. The films we watched this through Scaretober were a whole variety. We had some vampire movies, some slashers, some paranormal possession kind of stuff. Like, we had a whole range of stuff going on there. I'm just curious for each of you, like, do you have a favorite or least favorite style of horror movie?
Yeah, for me, easily, like my favorite tends to be things that are more spooky. There's a real mood in it, maybe like something around the occult or ghosts, spirits, where they really build up a mood and get under your skin, as opposed to like maybe some things like, I think I mentioned it before, but around like slasher movies or things that cut through your actual skin as opposed to get under your skin.
Yeah, I'm actually completely in alignment with Michael on that. I love the sort of paranormal horror movie. And the especially ones that are like ghost stories, because those are the ones that kind of like I find the scariest to me. And there's like a real sort of mystery usually in them as well, which is really interesting. So things like Woman in Black or The Ring or the Orphanage, which is a great Spanish horror film. Like those, The Others, like those are the kinds of ones that really get me. Least favorite genre, slasher and like gorer. I don't like torture porn. So yeah, I'd say those. But how about you, Chris? I mean, you're the one who sort of really grew up watching these.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting because I think that the ones for me that are still up there, I mean, I definitely like that kind of, paranormal possession kind of thing as well. It's kind of like the least explainable, and often I don't want the full explanation on a lot of these. But the other style of movie that I really do enjoy is like, I'll call it like survival horror. So, like zombie movies and like Last Man on Earth and that kind of stuff. So, like lots of zombie movies I love. Movies like A Quiet Place, where it's like, the last family maybe left out there. I don't know. And just that kind of sense of like, there is no help to be had in this situation. And I think that's where like, slasher movies often fall down, where you're like, just run away and there's a safe place somewhere else. Like, I know, okay, slasher movies I find kind of fall apart. And I'm with you, Evan, like the whole like body horror kind of style of movies is just not my bag. I don't love movies like Saw and whatever, where it's just like, all right, now I'm going to force you to chop your hands off. And you're like, yeah, I'm good. I think I'm good here. I'm going to move along. But I mean, I think for me, it's always that interesting kind of conversation about what it is about a horror movie that makes it, effective, that makes it scary, that makes it memorable. And like, Evan, what is it for you about a horror movie that makes it kind of like stick in your head?
Well, like I'm actually just going to sort of go out there and say, just as a genre itself, I think that horror is the best of cinema. Let me rephrase that. I think that horror can be the best of cinema. I think that horror does exactly what theater, when it was first made, was supposed to do, in that it gives the audience a truly cathartic experience, and that you are participating in watching a set of characters through their own sort of hubris be undone. And that, when it comes to like pure Greek tragedy with a capital T, is kind of like what horror can be. And I think we've watched a couple of examples of that in the last little while. But also, like we said with Halloween, there's something really primal about it, and that it really hits all of the things in the lizard brain. It's sexy and it's violent, and it really kind of speaks to the instincts in people. So when it's done well, it's kind of hitting all of the things that drive humans at a base level, and is also kind of the perfect encapsulation of art. Unfortunately, it is not often done well, but when it is, I think it is the best, truly.
I agree with what we said. I'd put it a little bit differently and say that there's so many genres that when they do something unexpected, it stands out. Like comedy works the same way. Comedy works on the whole, for me, works the best when it's something unexpected. You go like, whoa, yeah, I didn't see that coming, as opposed to going for the same tropes over and over. And that's where I think that horror can work so well, because when you reveal or serve up something unexpected, it's like, oh, I haven't seen this done that way before. It's so powerful. I'm still back, though, to what I was saying earlier around like the types of moods around the spookiness, the build up. So, I was so glad you mentioned the others. That's one of my favorite ones. Sixth Sense, I mentioned earlier in the previous episode, where they kind of feed into that. There's a build up, but it doesn't have that stupid thing that Chris mentioned, where it's like, look, you could just leave, or if it's a phone killing you, just don't answer the phone, or like these dumb things. The movies, they kind of have a thing where they're stuck, but they have to play through it, and you have to see it through somehow. Like that can be so powerful for me.
Yeah, I mean, I think part of that is, to your point, Michael, is that setup premise in the movie, right? And like, if that premise isn't there of like, all right, here's the thing that's interesting and I'll follow along for, like that for me is often the starting point of like, all right, you got to get your hooks into me early, make this interesting. And I mean, that's true of any movie, but I think especially in, horror, where part of this is for me to, feel the tension, be afraid, then you have to kind of introduce that early enough that I don't know what's happening. And I think that's part of it is, kind of like you're saying, is like, it needs to make sense. That premise kind of needs to make sense and continue to be logical, at least for me in some way, because so many horror movies have an interesting premise, but then devolve really quickly when it's like, oh, it was actually this thing underground that was a secret experiment. And you're like, oh, ugh. But I mean, I think it has to be interesting. It has to have that premise, but I think it also has to have that scariness to it. And for me, that scariness isn't like, jump scares are one thing, but I find jump scares on their own to be just, I don't know, frustrating. Like I find the jump is good when it comes from a place of like, I'm concerned about the character who's on screen, because they've built that character up and I'm now invested with the actual people in this movie. When it's just some of these slasher movies and you're like, I don't care about any of these people, like, go ahead and kill them. And now it's more about like, gore and cheering the killer on rather than, being afraid for actual people. Like, I think that is really critical. And I think how they, connect the dots with that the pacing that carries through. And that's been one of those things we've talked a lot about throughout Scaretober is pacing and where it has worked and where it hasn't, which makes me now ask kind of the first question about our Scaretober movies, which is out of these movies, which of these movies do you think had the best pacing? And Michael, maybe let's start with you.
It's interesting because we talked a lot about this when it came to The Exorcist, was it too slowly paced? Did it work? I actually think that Hereditary took that formula and ran with it very, very well. So for me, the vote easily is Hereditary. I thought it was an incredibly well-paced movie. The build-up was very effective for me. It was deliberate. It didn't feel like they were kind of taking too long in certain paces, and everything led to something else. So for me, that easily was the best paced movie of the ones we watched.
Yeah, I have to agree with you, Michael. As much as I love the pacing in The Exorcist, and I know that Chris doesn't, but he also watched the one that is 20 minutes longer and I think is quite baggy in its pacing. That Hereditary just brings a modern sensibility to it. It isn't 50 years old. It is, of the last 5 years, and its pacing is fantastic. It really just keeps ratcheting that tension, and big thumbs up to Ari Aster.
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to pile on there and just say that I think Hereditary had the best pacing as well. I mean, I think the pacing in The Exorcist and Us is also pretty good, but I mean, as Michael kind of pointed out, like they both have slow halves. So there's The Exorcist and the reverse Exorcist in Us, of just like the pacing isn't kind of consistent. And I think, again, going back to like the premise and the tension and the scares, that's where those two fell off for me. I actually didn't mind the pacing in The Lost Boys. It's not a good movie. So that's kind of a thing. And like Halloween for me was just like way out of whack on the pacing, where it just didn't get there. But I'm curious then. So out of these movies, I mean, a variety of actors, a variety of characters come into this. I'm curious, like which of these movies do you feel had, the most intriguing, the most complex, the most compelling characters in it?
I almost feel like that is an unfair question, because there are a couple of pieces that we've looked at here. Hereditary for one, which was written kind of as a complex character piece, and then had the horror element put in, versus like, Halloween being written in 10 days or 3 weeks or whatever it was. Yeah. And Lost Boys being like, Goonies with vampires, and then getting this sort of like, no, it has to be sexy teenagers kind of grafted on top of it. So it's a funny sort of thing where there's such a disparity between the levels, because like Hereditary are very complex characters and interesting, and The Exorcist is complex, interesting characters, and Us is, for the most part, I mean, certainly, Lupita Nyong'o's character is interesting and complex. The other ones sort of kind of fall off a little bit around her.
The complexity comes in the plot in that one, I think, maybe more than the characters. Yeah,
exactly. So, I mean, I'm going to go with like Hereditary or The Exorcist, I'd say, out of those ones. But I think that it is sort of, I don't know that it's a level playing field for that at all.
I'm less worried about the level playing field, because some genius soundtracks or movies or albums are made in like 5 days. But what I would say more is, I really agree with you about the thing with Us versus Hereditary, because I thought this was super hard. I thought that the Us characters, especially the other versions, the red versions, were so interesting. But ultimately, I have to say, I think Hereditary was more interesting because they build up, they slowly reveal more things about the grandmother. They slowly reveal things about the history, where I go, oh, that is super interesting. So for me, I would put it to that. But like I said, less about the how long it took something to make or when it was made, because I think they still could have been interesting. I think Hereditary wins just on its own merit.
Yeah, I mean, I'm kind of up there too. I definitely would agree though with Evan to say like The Exorcist has intriguing and complex and interesting characters. I think those are the two that stood out for me as Hereditary and The Exorcist. Like I mean, I don't know. I find the breadcrumbs and following the connected dots to be interesting. I don't necessarily love the characters in and of themselves. Maybe more what they connect to in terms of the story and, the societal conversation and whatever that you can have as a result. But like, I find it pretty compelling watching, we talked a lot about the acting in The Exorcist and how that actually ties you in. And, regardless of my, qualms or whatever with the first half's pacing, it's still brilliant performances and, great characters that connect you into that movie, which makes the second half, makes me sit through to get to the second half and makes the second half of that movie pay off because, it isn't just about the evil. It's about the people who are kind of having to come to terms with facing it, which I found really compelling. But I said it pretty clearly, I think in our Hereditary episode too, that, Hereditary is my favorite thing that we've watched and probably up there on my all-time list of movies now that I've seen it. So they're both pretty stellar, but it's one of the interesting things that you see across these movies, because these movies run from, the 70s all the way through till, just a couple years ago. There's this thing where you can see that horror kind of reflects what's going on in society. There's a Stephen King quote where he talks about like, if movies are the dreams of the mass culture, then horror movies are the nightmares. Like what do you think about this idea of like the horror genre reflecting and responding and mirroring the societal fears and anxieties and norms of their era?
I think it's probably like an ideally suited genre for this because you can do so much with it. You can do so much with the fear of drugs, of replacement, of body image, of aliens, of anything. It's incredibly well suited for it. But I would also say that the stakes are sort of higher if you do it poorly. It's a little bit like how kid movies could or kid shows could be used to explain complex topics. Now, kids, we're going to do this. It can be incredibly powerful, but if you do it poorly, it can backfire so much. And I think that's very true for horror movies as well, that, you can go way overboard. And it becomes too obvious what you're trying to actually tell with this. But as a genre, I think it is perfectly suited for describing whatever's going on and kind of like relaying it in different ways that people can relate to.
It's an interesting point too, Michael, just because, to that point, I think, here we are in 2023 and, byproducts of our years growing up and that kind of thing. So it can be interesting to look back at some of these movies from a previous era where you might have whatever, like horror movies from the 50s that are, all these fears of like science and space and, giant
and communism
exactly.
That's
right.
with, body snatchers and alien invasions. It's
right.
Communism. Exactly.
And then you get into like the kind of social upheaval of the 60s and 70s and you're watching stuff like Night of the Living Dead. And, there's this kind of like distrust of authority and traditional values and, that kind of thing. So I think it's easy to sit there and look at it and kind of be like, well, I don't really get it. And it doesn't necessarily hold up in the same way, partly because we're not byproducts of those areas or eras. But I think you're bang on that it's a thing that can touch on those, I don't know, those things that make you uncomfortable and, you're not quite sure why. And it's easy to kind of hook onto that feeling of discomfort. And, horror isn't the only genre that can do this. Science fiction can do this, like, other forms of like thrillers and stuff. Like I'm sure 50 years from now, people will be looking back and being like, man, why were those people making so many movies about like AI and robots and stuff killing them? Because I don't know, the robots are great. We love our robots. Why were they so afraid of these things?
Yeah. To your point, Chris, I think that you can definitely sort of like drill down into, different like larger topics, sort of make allegories for the topics with a bunch of different genres. But I think that horror is the one that gives you sometimes the deepest insight into a culture and a society, because it really feeds off of, as you said, like it feeds off of the fears of that society, like you said in the Halloween podcast, but also really about the taboos of that society and how deeply ingrained they are. So like, whereas science fiction is so good at being like, okay, here's really kind of like the barometer of where people's heads are at now and what their worries are, what their concerns are. Yeah. Maybe we're
and
going
how
to
things are going to go wrong down the line.
Exactly. Whereas horror is like where you scratch under the surface and it's like, this says so much about the actual like underpinnings of this society. It's in so many ways like, horror as a genre is kind of equivalent to our society's fables and fairy tales, which were horrific in their original forms, right? Because they really do kind of drill down into that deeper part of the psyche, and that's kind of what I really love about it. I love knowing that, like, the thing in British horror, it's really like there's a very thin veneer between, civility and, the freaky pagan stuff that lurks just below, kind of thing. And it's sort of why like folk horror is so good in England, and, so much, Japanese horror is like you violate this taboo, whether it was explicit or not, a societal taboo, and now there is no escape, and you're going to die. You walked into this house, you are going to die now. Doesn't matter if you didn't know what you were doing. You violated something.
I think there's kind of two roads that a good horror can run down, and one is, to your point, is very like, I'll say like pro authority or pro rules, where it's like, don't go in the woods, don't go down the wrong thing, don't go home with the wrong people, don't, that kind of thing. And then down the other route is like very, anarchy, right? It's like all of this shit that we've built should be blown up because everybody's out to get us and they're all conspiring against us. And like, I think you can see the flip flops, or maybe like just trends as these kind of come and go through the eras, right? Like you've got like, Rosemary's Baby, where there's, kind of like Hereditary, this kind of plot against this poor woman. And it's in this era of social upheaval and don't trust the government and whatever. I think it's interesting too, when we look at some of the stuff that's come out in the last, decade or so, where I think you kind of have some of these, questioning those norms kind of movies coming out again, right? We've got, like, we talked about Get Out. We've got Us. I think there's a lot of stuff coming up about roles of relationships or how isolation plays into that, whether that's, explicit in some movies like, The Witch, which takes place in the middle of nowhere with this family kind of falling apart and being pulled apart. Hereditary, like there's a bunch of movies that have kind of studied these things. Even the remake of, The Invisible Man with Elizabeth Moss, which is a great movie. And it's like, it's basically like an abusive relationship, right? And so it's interesting to see how it's like questioning kind of gender roles and those types of things, social status, racism, like all this kind of stuff that's come out over the last decade. And it definitely feels like we're in one of those, like, maybe blow it all up kind of anti-establishment modes.
Anti-establishment because because everything that has been created around you is trapping you, and none of it will save you, I think is that sort of like slight kind of third version kind of off of your second.
Right. Yeah. And I'll just say, like, not my favorite horror movie of all times, but like playing exactly into the fears of the era is like Host. I don't know if you two have seen
Oh, I
Host.
haven't seen it yet.
But it's, a Zoom seance gone wrong, which came out in the middle of the pandemic when we were all doing, Zoom calls with all of our friends. And like, it's a great way to kind of capture that, like, this thing that is connecting you is also kind of awful, and just that couldn't be more pandemic-y. And I wonder what people 20 years from now will be thinking about it, but very topical and appropriate for where we were just a couple years ago. That's probably a good place to take a quick intermission. And on the other side, we can get back into talking about our Scaretober movies and prodding into which of them had the most interesting premise. So up front, I said that, one of the things for me about a horror movie that made it good and interesting is the premise, the setup. What is, why are we here? What's going on? And it's one of those things that I find most compelling about it. So I'm intrigued for both of you. Out of the movies that we watched for Scaretober, which one did you think actually had the most interesting premise?
This is one of those, I'm going to feel a little bit like a hypocrite because I'm now going to say what Evan said before in a different way. Like, I think Us did the best job because it actually explained the premise. In a way, The Exorcist and Hereditary had more interesting premises in terms of the lore behind it. But in The Exorcist's case, it was fed to you it was like a droplet here, it was a droplet there, and then later you could piece it together. In Hereditary, it was kind of like just the very, very final act. But I felt like Us had a really super interesting new premise that we hadn't seen before. And they actually explained it, and it was core to the story. So for me, that's easily the winner.
Yeah, I'm with you, Michael. I think that Us had the most interesting premise of all of the films that we watched, and very much sort of for the same reasons. I mean, sexy teenage vampires are fun, and I can't say that the premise of Halloween is particularly interesting, but
evil.
Yeah, evil just keeps coming, I guess. But it's like we've seen a lot of sort of like, and to this point, we've seen a lot of possession movies. So is that an interesting premise? Yeah, not so much. And Hereditary is sort of that too. But yeah, Us, in terms of like just a genuinely like interesting premise, that's what I'm going for too.
Yeah, I'm up there with you as well. Like, I think Us is an interesting setup to the movie, and you're, right from the get-go, you're kind of wondering what's going on. I mean, I found I liked the setup in Hereditary, that this is a movie right off the bat about, death and grief, which I found very compelling as well. But I mean, I think the Us setup is very like, it definitely gets its hooks into you in a really compelling way. I mean, I think it didn't hold me there for the whole movie, and that's where I didn't feel as strongly about it as you guys did, because I kind of found that partway through that movie, it stopped being, I don't know, it turned into an action movie more or whatever through that last half. And it's really like, like I was saying up front, it's that like the premise that continues to pay off throughout the movie as you unravel it. Right. But I definitely think up front, the like, what's happening here in Us is great. I think that was really, really great. And, I think it kind of ties into all the nuance that goes into these movies, all the breadcrumbs, as we've spent so much time talking about. I'm curious for each of you. I mean, I think there's especially 3 movies that we're likely to be pointing at on this one, but out of the stuff that we watched, which movie was it that you found yourself thinking about the most after watching it?
I still, yeah, and as you know, The Exorcist is one of my top 5 favorite films, but that is the one that still, after I turn it off, I keep thinking about. Hereditary. The first time I saw it, and we have to remember that like I was the person who had already seen it. That stuck with me the first time I watched it for a while, and the second time, as you said, Chris, it is like watching a very different film, and so it sort of stuck with me less. But the Exorcist is the one that, I can't help but to keep going over it. And now that I have a young kid as well, like just the horrors of bad things happening to a kid for no reason other than evil, just really like it's the kind of thing that literally keeps me up at night.
It's interesting because that, in a way, you could have argued that the point for Hereditary just with that. But for me, it's Us, because Hereditary was scary, but I didn't really it didn't leave me with so much stuff to think about later. I didn't worry too much about who is this demon, what's the thing going on. Like, I didn't think about it so much. But Us was different because it sort of suggested there's this thing that's been going on forever, and now it's their time. Now they're coming up and doing something. And yeah, I think I mentioned it at the time. It's sort of like I was starting to think around, okay, so what's next? Is this like The Walking Dead? Is this step one now of like what comes after this? So I thought about Us a lot more after, because I was picturing what's going on here next. And that left me with way more unresolved ideas that I was really interested in.
That's interesting. I think it's the, a split jury, I guess, on this one, because for me it was Hereditary, which I don't think is a surprise. After, talking about it, I very much loved that movie, and I loved the crafting of that story and everything that went into it. And that's the thing that has kept me thinking about it. I think Us had a great point to make, but I got the point and then I kind of moved on. And I found, The Exorcist isn't something I want to go back to. And I think, actually, to what we were talking about earlier, I think there's almost elements of, or moments of body horror almost in that movie, like certainly the hospital scene and that kind of thing, which I don't love, especially with a little kid. So that's what kind of turns me off. But just the crafting of Hereditary, and it's, in some ways for me, similar to, when we talked about In Bruges, and how there's all these connect the dots that go through that film, and when you go back you see something else, and you can just appreciate the craftsmanship that went into writing that, and that's ultimately why I'm like, okay, Hereditary is something that's going to be back on the playlist for me a lot sooner than any of these other ones that we've seen. So yeah, but definitely for me, it's Hereditary. I can't wait to watch that again. Though, probably going to be a little bit, but looking forward to getting back to it. One of the reasons in particular that I like Hereditary too, besides the writing, is just I found it the most scary. And that for me is, like I said, like it's got to have the scares. And, the scares for me is partly about, connecting to those characters and having that, the scary moments being connected to something more than just like something jumped out of the dark at you or off the edge of the screen or whatever. Like I definitely got a sense of, connection to those characters, being concerned about the people in the thing, feeling a sense of dread, feeling out of control, and that I was kind of in the filmmaker's hands. And that was a really great payoff to me. So the joy of rewatching that is that it was also an intense, scary movie, and certainly not as much so on a second or whatever watching, but definitely still very much there. But I'm curious from both of you, like, what are the types of scares that you do enjoy the most?
For me, I couldn't agree with you more. Like the whole thing around the creepy, moody build-up ones, as opposed to the jump scares. that to me is massive. So, we talked about this with Jacob's Ladder, where you kind of get the just the hint of something, the horns or the tails, or I've talked about the Sixth Sense a lot, like just how like the first time that we see the dead girl in that movie, and it's scary, it's spooky, but it's not a jump scare. So I'm way bigger into that, something moving slowly in the background as opposed to like camera jumping to it. That to me is just so much scarier, and I love that about some of the movies we've talked about.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sort of with you, Michael. I love a really good ghost reveal. I really love, like, in terms of like, a camera pan where there's like maybe something in the frame and you were like, whoa, was that, what did I just see? So, Hereditary's got a couple of those. I really like, one of my favorite scares in Hereditary is the ghost of Charlie appearing in the room and then the head falling off and rolling on the floor, and being the ball, which is really, really spooky and a great scare on a scare. Because it's the tension of the ghost and then something really unexpected, creepy happens. And it also like reminded me of a scare from a really great old ghost movie. I think it's about 1977, 1978 as well, called The Changeling with George C. Scott. And that one has like this ball that just like drops down the stairs, like thump, 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 and it's like really spooky and really, really good. So it's a really good like ghost thing happening, and like in the Conjuring, like where they do like the knock knock, and then you hear the knock knock from inside the closet, and like it's not anyone alive. Those are my favorite. I love those.
Yeah, I definitely agree. And I think it's, I kind of referenced like The Invisible Man earlier, and it's just those moments where like it's that same kind of thing where it's that reveal, right? Where it's just like, oh, what's there? Is somebody there? Could it? And it's like, trying to pull the sheet and he's standing on the sheet while invisible, or throwing the paint onto him as he's like coming up the top of the ladder. Anyway, these moments where you're just like, oh, yes, of course he's right there. But like, it's all in context of this thing that makes sense, as opposed to just like, I don't know, like, I recently watched Barbarian, and like, there's a scary thing that chases you and jumps out of the dark. Like, okay, you got me, I guess. But like, I don't leave that feeling like I was connected to it anyway. You just scared me because something jumped out. And it's the same, Evan, earlier you referenced Ring, which, the first time you see that movie is like, oh, what's happening? Unexpected. And
yeah, Samara crawling out of the TV, and then the jump cut that happens to her standing in front of the guy. That is like one of my favorite ghost scares ever.
Ever.
So good. I'm so good.
I watched that movie in university. I was watching it on a computer at night, lights off. And it meant, because I was watching it at my desk with my back turned to my entire apartment too. And it just felt like, again, like the best and worst decision all at once, because that scared the absolute hell out of me. Speaking of scaring the absolute hell out of ourselves, I think it's time that we discuss handing out a new award to be forever impaled, I guess, on our wall of fame, the Scream Supreme Award for Scariest Movie. Now, I will say that this can be any movie we have watched, though I have a very strong sense that this will most likely be something from Scaretober. We all know how scary we thought The Lost Boys was. So, Evan, let's begin with you. What movie would you propose for a nominee for the Scream Supreme Award?
Empire Records. No,
I agree. It's terrifying. Yeah. Seconded, sold.
Yeah. Scream Supreme. I am going to say I'm going to say The Exorcist, and it's only because the Hereditary is really, really scary on its first watch. Really scary, genuinely scary film. And on the second, I found that it loses its power. It becomes a very interesting film to watch. The Exorcist still has moments in it that just freak me out. So I'm gonna say The Exorcist.
Okay, interesting, because for me, that didn't even show up in my list. I think Hereditary wins. I said at the time that Us scared the crap out of me, but when you really think about it, when I really thought about it, I think Hereditary did a better job at really leaning into the creepy stuff and the build-up, whereas Us, I think, was incredibly scary, but also had more of the action. The Exorcist didn't even go into there, but maybe also because I thought about, again, the one-time viewing thing. Which movie is going to scare the bejesus out of you when you watch it? So less about the coming back to watch it, but I think for me, hands down, Hereditary wins.
Yeah, I'm there with you, Michael. I think it's no surprise with all I've said about the movie that Hereditary for me was scary. I still find that movie tense and scary, even rewatching it. And I think it'll probably be more so when I've had more of a gap between viewings. I'll say that I think The Exorcist is a tense movie. I don't find it a particularly scary movie. And again, it's like how you measure what scares you, what creeps you out, whatever. I think it's creepy. I think it's tense, especially, once you move into the kind of the second half and there's more to do with Reagan's possession. I think, as Michael dubbed it, the reverse Exorcist is true of Us. That I think the first half is creepy and intense and tense, but I don't find myself necessarily scared, whereas I found myself genuinely scared, especially to your point, Evan, on the first watching of Hereditary. Mm-hmm. It is creepy. There's actually a website out there that has done a series of studies where they monitor audiences' heartbeat as they watch these various horror movies, and Hereditary is 6th on their list. I've seen some of the movies above it. They might have more jump scares, but they're not necessarily good movies. But so I guess that makes it kind of official.
I'm happy for Hereditary to take that award.
Well, and there you go. Congratulations, Mr. Astor. We will cut the head off of our award and mail you whichever half you prefer. Congratulations to Hereditary for being inducted into our Scream Supreme Award on the Wall of Fame, which leaves us only one thing, I suppose, to talk about. Out of all the movies that we watched through Scaretober, which movie would each of you recommend the most, and which is the movie that you would most recommend that people just miss?
So I'll say it won't be a surprise. Avoid Halloween. Please avoid Halloween. Now that's out of the way.
This public service announcement has been brought to you by
anyone alive of common sense. For me, it really comes down to what sort of thing. Like Hereditary and Us are so good in different ways. And I would want to know who I'm recommending these to, because like Us has that action element that for some people is going to be an unbeatable thing. Hereditary has like that slow build up, that constant creepiness thing that for some people is going to be the most amazing thing in the world. So honestly, I would want to know a thing or two about the person who I'm recommending it to before I say it. But those two, you can't go wrong with if you know a little bit about what they do. Us a little bit more on the action side, Hereditary more on the mood, the character, and the creep side.
Yeah, I'm gonna say, you can miss The Lost Boys. Like you can just go ahead and skip that one. In terms of the one that I would recommend the most, I'm going to say The Exorcist, because it is it's the OG. It is the one from which, everything else stands on its shoulders. So The Exorcist would be the one that I would recommend the most. I will say that Us and Hereditary are excellent films, and that, like we said in the Us podcast, 50 years from now, kind of like the way that people look back at Vertigo and dissect that, I think people will be dissecting Us, because I think it's really beautifully crafted. I think that Hereditary is a beautifully crafted movie. But if I have to recommend one horror movie for someone to see, The Exorcist. That takes it.
It's interesting. Yeah, I'm kind of similar to you. I think, my clear winner, I think is no surprise, is going to be Hereditary. I love that movie. I think it's great. I have already recommended it to somebody who was, our babysitter who was here not too long ago, who's a teenager looking to hang out with her friends on Halloween, and was like, we're going to watch a scary movie. And I was like, well, have you seen Hereditary? So, I've already done so. I definitely think that The Exorcist and Us are both worth watching. I think Exorcist is probably a close second for me, then maybe a step down to Us, and then a big step down to Halloween, and then like banana peel slip down a water slide down to get to Lost Boys. The Lost Boys is kind of irredeemably bad and just not something I enjoyed. And I'm kind of surprised that after all of Michael's intense dislike of that movie when we recorded our Lost Boys episode, that somehow Halloween managed to squeak past it for his least favorite. Michael, like, where do those two stand in relation to each other for you?
It's a good question, honestly. Like, Lost Boys should have known better, because the time that had elapsed since Halloween, so it should have been better. But it is so bland to me. It's like, I can't be so upset with it because it didn't try to do anything in my mind. I'm really upset with Halloween more because it was just so upsettingly bad on in every way.
I think, for all three of us, I think there's clearly 3 movies that sit in an upper tier and 2 movies that sit in a lower one. But I will say, I think it was a ton of fun getting a chance to, watch some creepy, scary movies. And I think one of the cool things that's happened as a result of this too is some of our conversations that have happened outside of this podcast about like, what else is good? What else scares you? Evan has thrown a few movies my way, including The Orphanage, which he mentioned on this one. For me, it's some other ones.
Yeah, don't sleep on that.
Yeah, and I'm digging into a number of other movies. Recently watched Rec, which is another Spanish movie from the same era that Evan was mentioning. So there's a bunch of great stuff out there to go find that whatever floats your boat or maybe sticks a knife in it. Whatever your thing is. There's lots of cool options, and it's been fun kind of getting this chance to go through this with you guys and find what works and what doesn't for us. And on that note, that's what we thought about the movies we watched for Scaretober.
Yep, that's a wrap on Scaretober, and also a wrap on the podcast itself. This is the final episode of How Did You Miss This? A big thanks to my co-hosts, Michael Hansen and Krista Shane, for all of their hours of movie watching, research, conversation, and editing. Extra thanks to Michael for the original music he's provided to score this thing. And a massive thanks to all of you out there for listening along over the last year. It's been a blast. You'll be missed.